The manufacturing of a semiconductor begins with the creation of an ultra-specialized type of light.
That's Chris Miller, describing to me one of the most complex pieces of manufacturing in the world, that of a semiconductor.
The transistors, all of the...
Miller is an associate professor at the Tufts University in Boston. He got interested in semiconductors or chips while researching about the US-Soviet arms race in the Cold War. Eventually, he wrote a book on it called Chip War. The book is a really exhaustive read on the subject. You'll hear more of Miller in today's episode.
All of the shapes on a semiconductor emerged from this process of using light to print the shapes.
Now, semiconductors are quite simply the core of all computing. They are tiny chips no bigger than my fingernail that power almost every electronic device in the world, from the smartphone on which you're listening to me to your microwave and TV. Your car could have 100 of them, as does the factory that made the car. Your recent best friend ChatGPT? Its brains are these chips. A nuclear reactor, a power grid, guided missiles that have been hitting their targets with amazing precision since the Gulf War in 1991, they're all powered by these chips. Semiconductors were invented in the US in 1961. America dominated this industry for years. The leadership then shifted to Japan, then back to the US, then again to the East, before settling into a one-of-a-kind, complex global supply chain spanning continents. It's a delicate chain, linked by super specialized companies, businesses that are often monopolies or oligopolies. The breakage in one link can disrupt industries across the world. Remember the massive global shortage of cars and phones when a handful of chip foundries in Taiwan shut down during COVID? Yes, exactly. Few industries are so dynamic. The processing power of these chips, dependent on transistors or tiny switches smaller than the coronavirus, that power doubles every year. No other segment of any economy in the world has ever had such productivity gains, says Miller. The global semiconductor market is expected to double to $1 trillion by 2030. No wonder chips are now the most critical intersection of technology, economics, and politics. In fact, they are, as my senior colleague and guest in this episode, Pranab Dhal Samanta puts it,
something like what nuclear weapons were to the last century, through the Cold War.
The war for the control of the chip industry is heating up, and the deadliest battle is between the OGs, the US, and China. Late entrant, but a super aggressive, often problematic conqueror. But why am I talking about it today? Because one country that has been trying to make it big in this space for close to 4 decades finally made a breakthrough last week.
India's semiconductor journey has well and truly begun today, and especially coming at a time when the US is hosting the Indian Prime Minister. The cabinet has approved Micron's bet on India as a semicon destination. This is the first such approval granted to an applicant under India's flagship scheme for semiconductors.
So what is this chip's journey from computer logic to powerful geopolitical tool? What are the complexities that go into making a chip? Why is the US-China fight so critical? And why does the world want China to lose? Why is India so late to the party, and what are its prospects now? Can we ace the race? All that and more in today's episode. It's Thursday, the 29th of June. I'm Anirban Chowdhury, and this is the Morning Brief. Chris, hello and welcome.
Hi, Anirban. It's good to be talking to you on the Morning Brief.
So, Chris, defense and military definitely have been the genesis and the driving force behind semiconductors. And that's how they became such a massive geopolitical tool, right? Let's talk about that.
The chip became a powerful geopolitical tool from its earliest invention. The first chips were used in missile guidance systems during the early Cold War because the US military was looking for a way to miniaturize computing power and deploy it in guidance computers for missiles during that arms race between the US and the Soviet Union. And from that point all the way up to the present, semiconductors have been critical for defense and intelligence systems. Today, almost every type of military systems has dozens or hundreds, even thousands of semiconductors inside. And many of these semiconductors are highly advanced, capable of undertaking sensing or communications capabilities, or perhaps most importantly today, helping military systems act semi-autonomously. And today, the application of AI to defense uses is one of the new frontiers that militaries are exploring. And as they try to produce military systems that take advantage of the most advanced computing capabilities, the most advanced chips will be critical inputs to this effort.
Let's talk about another use case. In fact, the use case that everyone's talking about. How are chips powering AI?
Semiconductors are powering AI because to train an advanced AI system requires access to some of the most advanced semiconductors. If you look, for example, at how a system like OpenAI's GPT systems, which were used to produce ChatGPT, if you look at how they're trained by reading vast sums of text. This process requires an extraordinary amount of data processing because there's lots of text on the internet, and it takes extraordinary amounts of text to develop the capabilities that we've seen in tools like ChatGPT. And so the processing power needed to train these systems is something that just a couple of companies' chips can produce. And what you find is that today, across the world, there's a deficit of the most advanced AI training chips, above all, the types of GPU, graphics processor unit chips produced by NVIDIA, because these are the most commonly used semiconductors for this type of high-powered AI training.
NVIDIA is the latest poster boy of the AI revolution. It makes 90% of the chips that power AI. It's a near monopoly in this segment. The company's share price has recently seen a surge of 200%. It's the most valuable chip company in the world. NVIDIA and its struggles, that of an almost lone company against massive chip demand for AI, is actually a good example of what we are just going to talk about. Semiconductors have been globalizing much before the term was coined, and today the industry is dependent on a complex, delicate supply chain dotted by, as Miller calls them, chip choke points.
From the earliest stage of a chip's production, there are a series of choke points throughout the semiconductor supply chain in which one company often has predominant market share, or in some cases a complete monopoly of the know-how and machinery needed to make a chip. The production, for example, of the most advanced lithography tools is done by just one company, ASML, in the Netherlands, which has 100% market share. In many other segments, there's markets that are scarcely less concentrated. For example, there's one company, Taiwan's TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, that produces around 90% of the most advanced processor chips, the types of chips that are in smartphones and computers, as well as in advanced data centers. If you look at the production of many of the tools needed to make chips, you find comparable levels of concentration where it's just one or two companies capable of producing the most precise types of chip-making tools. And then finally, the design of semiconductors is also something where there's, in many cases, highly concentrated markets. And so that's why the chip market is defined by these monopolies or oligopolies, because at every step of the supply chain, there's just a couple of firms that are capable of producing at the cutting edge.
Here's a passage from Miller's Chip War to make you understand the journey, from sand to silicon to semiconductor. A typical chip might be designed with blueprints from the Japanese-owned UK-based company called ARM by a team of engineers in California and Israel using design software from the United States. When a design is complete, it's sent to a facility in Taiwan which buys ultra-pure silicon wafers and specialized gases from Japan. The design is carved into silicon using some of the world's most precise machinery. These tools are produced primarily by 5 companies, 1 Dutch, 1 Japanese, and 3 Californian, without which advanced chips are basically impossible to make. Then, the chip is packaged and tested, often in Southeast Asia, before being sent to China, the world's largest consumer of chips, for assembly into a phone or computer. OPEC's 40% share of world oil production looks unimpressive by comparison. While the complexities of supply chain and production controls have led to mutual dependence among countries, it has also led to massive efforts to protect their chip turfs. Top among those nations is the US, which remains the brain trust of chip making but has long lost the position as its top manufacturing hub. The US Chips and Science Act, which was passed recently, entails investment of $53 billion in chip making and research. It seeks to lower costs, create jobs, and strengthen supply chains. Here's US President Joe Biden before signing the act last year.
America invented the semiconductors. Over 30 years ago, America had 40% of the global production of these chips. And then something happened. American manufacturing, the backbone of our economy, was hollowed out. We let semiconductor manufacturing go overseas. And as a result, today, we barely produce 10% of the semiconductors, despite being a leader in chips design as well as research. Folks, we need to make these chips here in America to bring down everyday costs and create jobs. Today, I'm signing the law of the Chips and Science Act, a once-in-a-generation investment in America itself, a law that the American people can be proud of.
One of the stated objectives of the CHIPS Act is to counter China. Now, China's semiconductor story is irregular at best. It consumes more than half the world's produced chips. In fact, it spends more on chips than it does on oil. Scores of chip companies have come up in China in the last few years, but to quote from Chip Wars again, it still supplies just 4% of the world's silicon wafers and other chip-making materials, 1% of the tools used to fabricate chips, 5% of the market for chip designs, and its market share is only 7% in the business of fabricating chips. None of this fabrication capacity involves high-value, leading-edge technology. So, China has been slow, it's been trying to grow, and the US has been trying to stop that growth. It has again and again restricted Chinese chip industry's access to technology and trained manpower. Other countries like Japan and Netherlands are probably following suit.
So now if you look at the geopolitics of today, so the first thing what China did, and as it forked away, is it started investing large sums of money in research and design.
That's Pranab again. Pranab is ET's Associate Executive Editor and political guru. He's passionate about geopolitics and an expert in reading the tea leaves on how countries and their governments will behave.
Second, the US was the largest consumer of products using semiconductor or chips. From a consumer point of view, China is now even narrowing that gap. So from research to the consumption end, China has sort of trying to narrow the gap with the Americans. This, with the politics of the day between US and China, there is a relationship of competition and conflict, has created problems for the rest of the world. The second piece of this whole thing is China's competitive or sort of adversarial relationship with its neighbors, namely Taiwan, Japan, all these countries, even others who are smaller players in this, in the Southeast Asian economies, be it Malaysia, Philippines. It wants to maintain a dominant political relationship, and Taiwan, we know, obviously it won't. As a result of that, it has shown the tendency to use economic issues as a method of aggression. What is famously in our world of strategic politics is called weaponizing economics. If you weaponize that, that means the supply chain, I can actually squeeze you. So the seamlessness with which this whole ecosystem was operating now has a problem because China is not wanting to finish the system. It wants to use its political and economic clout to assert dominance and also increase capabilities that controls the ecosystem from one end.
And so, for protection from these geopolitical shocks, guardrails are critical.
The first thing is to protect. So they are putting these protectionist measures because of this very seamless ecosystem. There's no control, and countries like China and others just continue to benefit at a very rapid pace. Now, what do you do next? You create alternate arrangements. Then once you find alternate routes, you want to put what the Americans love to call the guardrails to that route, which are nothing but rules and regulations. So if you were to look at it in the present context, Quad is one such canal. Indo-US, Australia, Japan collaboration, you can add a few here and there as well. And you put guardrails on it, and maybe you can have a supply chain along those lines. If you look at it, something of the sort, broadly on technology, not just on semiconductors, was agreed at the last Quad meet. The geopolitics is forcing countries now to de-risk themselves from China, de-risk themselves from overall geopolitics. So you will have new clubs, new rules, new associations, and new security measures where some will be there in the room and some will be outside the room.
As it happens, India is in the room. It is part of the club. Quad that Pranab just spoke about, or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, has India as one of its 4 members. In fact, it is improving relationships with the US that has given India its much delayed break in the global semiconductor market. And Pranab said India has the backing of a large part of the world.
There are two things which are working for India. One is that India is politically most acceptable. The more India succeeds, the better it is for global balance of power, and succeeds in every aspect, politically, militarily, economically, technologically. And that's a broad consensus or understanding across major powers of the globe. So in that sort of a big picture backdrop, investing in India and getting India to do whatever, and that includes semiconductors, the world would agree, and they are agreeing, as long as India is willing to take on that and do what it needs to do.
But what is the India chip story? Why have we been unsuccessful for so long? What does last week's announcement from Micron mean? And will India be able to make a dent in this very complex business? That's coming up. Here's Shelly Singh, Senior Editor ET Prime, Tech Ace, and an expert on chips.
If we go back also a bit in history, it was actually back in 1983 that India started off with semiconductors and by setting up a unit in Mohali, the Semiconductor Laboratory. And it was, interestingly, 4 years ahead of TSMC, which is today the world's largest chip maker. But that head start obviously didn't translate into any kind of meaningful chip production. And after that, India has had multiple policy initiatives, particularly from 2004-05 onwards, to attract global companies to set up fabs or chip-making factories, but with no result. Partly because global companies found the Indian market to be too small. In 2005, Intel was really close to setting up a fab in India. But at the last minute, that also didn't work out, and it shifted to Vietnam because of infrastructure and other issues. And while India was offering SOPs, other countries like Malaysia, Taiwan, China, South Korea offered more SOPs. So free land, sovereign guarantees on water and power, and chip makers went there because there was a larger market of electronics also in those countries.
But that did not deter the government at all. In fact, it redoubled its efforts to set up a semiconductor ecosystem in India, especially after COVID disrupted global supply lines.
So the result of that was the semiconductor policy of December 2021, which offered a $10 billion incentive package So it was initially open for about 45 days, but later the government increased the period from 3 months and then to 6 months. And they also offered more shops. So altogether, it's been a fairly attractive package to get semiconductor companies.
Shelley, one of the first proposals, so to speak,
Yeah.
one of the first serious proposals that the government got was the Foxconn Vedanta tie-up, right? But that
Yes.
doesn't seem to have gone anywhere.
So Vedanta tied up with Foxconn to set up this joint venture. Vedanta being a mining company, and it's after all silicon. But to begin with, the industry veterans and those people in the industry, they never thought really it was a great idea to get two companies forming a joint venture, and neither of the companies has any experience in fabs.
Right.
Semiconductors, or they are not even closely linked to it. Because Foxconn is a contract manufacturer. Yeah, it makes iPhones, it makes electronic goods for several companies, but it does not make semiconductors. Similarly, Vedanta has no experience at all in chip making. That apart, there were some doubts on the financial stability of the venture, in which Vedanta has 67% share. So they said there are issues with high debt to Vedanta Group, and this is a very capital-intensive project. So how are they going to do it? They finally didn't get the government nod.
And now it seems Foxconn is looking for fresh partners. Shelley, why don't you tell me about last week's announcement from Micron?
So Micron is a world leader in memory chips. It is not setting up a manufacturing facility, but an assembly, test, marking, and packaging unit, or what's called an ATMP unit. Such units test and assemble the chips which are sent to them, and then they in turn send it to the customers. So $2.75 billion Micron facility, in which Micron will put about $850 million. Half the investment is coming from the central government and about 20% from the state government, that's Gujarat, where the plant is supposed to come up.
So now an ATMP facility or that function is fairly lower down in the supply chain or in the whole chain of, manufacturing. And that is where, India wants to reach. It actually wants to set up chip fabrication units. And
Yes.
that is one of the most painstakingly complex undertakings in the world. Can you tell me what kind of investment and work goes into setting up such a fab facility?
So as you said, fab is one of the most complex and high-tech factories in the world. It's expensive. A decent-sized fab with a capacity of, say, 30,000 wafers a month can cost about $5 billion and take 4 years to build. And before you start laying a single brick, before you start making the fab, you have to kind of tie up to the buyer, with the buyer, and who will buy and what will you make. So these are typically long-term arrangements, like an Apple doing more of it in-house now. So if it were to be buying from a TSMC, it will say, look, okay, for the next 3 years, we'll buy from you. No,
and Apple, I think, is the biggest customer of TSMC, isn't it?
Oh, yes. Apple is TSMC's top customer. Major cost of the fab, about 55-60%, is machines and tools. Now, equipment makers, these are, again, very complex equipment. So you will have to buy a lithographic machine from there, multiple ones, and each of these cost $150 to $175 million, one single machine. And the clean room for a chip factory is perhaps the cleanest place you will see or visit on Earth. To avoid contamination in the chip making process, the air in the fab clean room is filtered 1,000 times.
Wow.
Filtered to 1,000 times fewer airborne particles than a sterile hospital operating environment. This is done because even a single speck of dust can ruin the microcircuits and waste all the effort and millions of dollars. And then the gases, chemicals. Then you have labor. So India does not have any global scale fabs. We don't have the expat talent. We don't have the talent. So we'll have to rely on expats for that. And these don't come cheap. And there's a massive demand right now for such talent. Like I told you, 84 new fabs are coming up around the world. So the accuracy required is really high. The manufacturing process is really complex. The equipment suppliers are very few in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So all this makes it, the entire package, extremely complex and capital intensive.
You said the size of the market was a problem before. Is that changing now?
There's a lot of change happening. Local chip consumption is increasing. Companies like Apple are expanding their manufacturing units here via their contract manufacturer Foxconn, Pegatron, Wistron. And Google Pixel also recently said, okay, it's going to shift some of its manufacturing to India. Samsung is already here making a lot of equipment. So the whole ecosystem is coming together. At least the demand side of things is being taken care of. And we just have to tap in some of the global know-how, provide the right incentives.
Let's talk about the pros a little bit, India's definite proven capabilities in this segment. And I'm talking about design.
Yes.
Right? So 20% of chip design in the world is done by Indian talent, like you said. Why don't you take me through that a little? How has that evolved so much and so well?
So that also has a history to it. In India, we go back a bit, even as far back as the late 80s. Texas Instruments, one of the major American chip makers, it set up a facility late in the 80s in Bangalore. In fact, there's a famous photograph of how it transferred some of the equipment on bullock carts. So you can imagine the state that India was and where we are now.
Right.
And at the same time, they were setting up fabs around the world. So India obviously didn't get the fab from some of the global majors early on, but it built on the engineering talent that India had. And then you had Intel and several other companies also setting up chip design units in India. And there are more than, I think, 30 chip design facilities in India from global company. NVIDIA also has one. So chips designed in India go to facilities outside India for testing. So design is a good starting point. And now we have an ATMP unit from Micron. And then, it could all lead up to a fab eventually.
Okay.
So I think it's a long delayed story, but it's finally coming together.
So Shelly, what are the challenges before India on its way to becoming a semiconductor hub or a semiconductor manufacturing country?
Actually, there are quite a few challenges. So to begin with, we don't have any experience in chip making, barring the very small state-owned Mohali facility. Because the global companies, global investors are looking at the broader ecosystem. Now, our electronics manufacturing has just about started. And it's not ground-up manufacturing. We do not make the components that go into the electronics. So we rely a lot on imported kits. And so what goes for manufacturing is sort of assembling imported kits. We need to scale that up from importing components to actually making those components in India. That will give much more confidence to the global companies. Logistics is a big issue. We still do not have great connectivity to where the facility might be located. We have to ensure that movement of raw material, various goods needed in a fab is really super smooth and fast. We need that ecosystem because we are dealing with very high-tech, very sophisticated manufacturing, almost at an atomic level manufacturing, which is in turn dependent on 1,200 to 1,500 suppliers of various components. So the global companies want to be very sure that all this is present. Apart from, of course, that they will have to create clean rooms, they'll have to have ultra clean water resources, which can be done because they have a history of doing it and they can get global experts to get that running. But infrastructure build out is something which the government has to do.
And what about technology transfer? Surely India needs that as well from other countries.
It won't be easy. The companies are unwilling to part with the latest know-how. Like if India were to go and ask ASML to give us the absolute leading machines and all, say, look, you guys don't have any fabs or anything, but there's already a massive demand backlog that they're servicing because the 80 plus fabs that are coming up, because there's a massive demand for equipment. And there could be shortage of talent also because all the expats that we would like to hire, there's demand all over the world right now. And they could eventually be a chip plant.
So Shelly, how much time do you give India before it can start making its own chips?
So India is obviously several decades behind, but as Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks and days where decades happen. Now, we're seeing a convergence of things that is unfolding now, which will eventually lead up to a ground-up fab.
Right.
Probably, if all things do tie up, it will still be about 4 years, 5 years before we see a ground-up fab making chips in India.
Semiconductors power the modern world. These chips were built for two purposes: to bring computing power to the military and to reduce the size of computers which used to fill entire rooms. Which is just as well, because today, as the transistors embedded in a chip get tinier, the chip becomes more powerful, its reach deeper and wider. Moore's law has indeed worked in interesting ways. Like all great inventions, the story of the semiconductor chip is many things: innovation, disruption, wars, and balance of power. But as Maurice Chang, founder of Taiwanese giant TSMC, said recently, it's also the undoing of globalization. He should know, as he sees Taiwan caught between the two superpowers, US and China. It is, as Pranab said, the time of protectionism, of new rules, of access regimes, of new clubs. Which club you're a part of will decide which way your fate jumps. India is well placed that way. Its relations with the US has thawed. It's seen as a nation that can stand up to China. Many countries are cheering its chip ambitions. But will these ambitions be realized? A long, complex road lies ahead. The timeline Shelley gave me is for India to make 40 nanometer chips, nowhere near the most efficient ones powering machines today. India needs to build confidence among global companies, experience in electronics, super specialized infrastructure, and a massive marketplace. That will take years. Chang built TSMC on the back of what he called a grand alliance with companies across the world. That too will take a long time for India. So will India build the most powerful thing in the world? It will. Will it become something like the semiconductor capital of the world? Maybe not. Perhaps it doesn't even need to. What it has got is a seat at a power table. How it uses this opportunity will decide whether, like transistors on a silicon wafer, its role is imprinted on one of the most important evolution stories in recent times. That's it for today. You are listening to The Morning Brief. This is your host, Anirban Chowdhury. We hope you liked this episode. It was produced by Surohini Jain, sound designed by Rajas Nayak. Executive producers, Anupriya Nair, Arijit Burman, and myself. Do share, like, and subscribe, and listen to The Morning Brief as it drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you, and have a great remainder of the week. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits are mentioned in the description.